Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're going to explore the truth hidden for 20 years, secrets that could change everything James believes about his family and his love. Who is CEO Hung really? And why is the past suddenly coming back to demand answers? If you find this story intriguing, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming videos. That afternoon, the sky in front of the old house felt heavy, as if it carried all the words that had never been spoken. James stood still before the rusted iron gate, his breathing slowing as familiar memories rushed back. Everything was still there, unchanged. Only he was different now. Beside him, Hung stood quietly, his gaze deep and steady, as if he had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. Hung turned toward James and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "We didn't come here to fight," he said softly. "We came to understand. Whatever happens, you won't face it alone." James nodded, swallowing the tightness in his throat, and followed Hung inside. The living room was cold and suffocatingly silent. Mr. Han was already seated on the sofa, his back straight, his face severe like a familiar statue of authority and discipline. The ticking of the wall clock echoed through the room, stretching the silence until every second felt unbearably heavy. It was Hung who broke it. He spoke first, his voice calm but clear, saying that they were not here for business or status, but for James. Mr. Han slowly lifted his gaze, his sharp eyes settling on James, as if measuring whether this son was still within his control. James took a deep breath. For the first time in many years, he did not look away. He asked his father why his life had always been dictated, why his love for Diep had been forbidden, why every major decision had been made without a single explanation. Mr. Han replied in the familiar tone James had heard all his life, saying everything had been done for the good of the family. The answer made James laugh quietly, but there was no joy in it. He said that, for the family, always seemed to mean that he was the one who had to give up everything. The air in the room tightened. Hung leaned forward, his eyes no longer avoiding his father's. He said this was not merely disapproval of a relationship, but deliberate interference, isolation, and pressure that had pushed James to the brink. Mr. Huan stood and turned toward the window, his voice lowering as he said that some truths should not be unearthed. But James stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly yet firm. He said there was nothing worse than what he had already endured, and that he deserved to know the truth. When James spoke about being stranded abroad, having his passport taken and being unable to return, the room seemed to freeze. Hung turned sharply toward their father, fury flashing in his eyes for the first time. Mr. Han did not deny it. That cold admission cut through James's last remaining illusions like a blade. He did not shout or accuse. He simply described his collapse in a weary voice, saying that after everything he had hit rock bottom and, unexpectedly, felt relief, because for the first time he was living without anyone else's expectations. Hung stood beside James, his hand clenched tight, his voice low but sharp. He said their father had not protected James, but destroyed him. The silence that followed was no longer oppressive, but unstable. Under the dim yellow light of the old room, James realized the wall between him and his father had begun to crack. This confrontation had brought neither an apology nor forgiveness, but for the first time, the truth had been named, and James knew that from that moment on, he would no longer turn his back on the past. After those heavy words, the room fell silent again, but it was no longer the silence of domination. It felt more like an empty space waiting to be filled with truths that could no longer be hidden. Hung straightened, his eyes fixed on his father. There was no formal respect left, and no open defiance either. only the gaze of someone who had stood in the shadows long enough and was no longer afraid to step into the light. Hung spoke slowly but decisively. He said the issue had never truly been Diep, nor James's emotions. Something deeper, older, had been guiding their father's decisions all along. When Hung directly questioned the past, about the time their father had suddenly gone abroad and returned with wealth and power, James felt a chill run down his spine. It was the first time he had heard Hung speak of it so directly, without avoidance or detours. Mr. Huan sighed and walked slowly back toward his chair, as if each step dragged a heavy memory behind it. He began to speak, not with pride, but with the voice of a man who had lived too long with fear. He talked about poverty, about promising himself he would never let his family bow to anyone. He spoke of opportunities that came with shadowy deals. Shortcuts, he told himself, were temporary. But power and the fear of losing everything carried him far beyond what he had first intended. James listened without interrupting. In his father's words, he no longer heard control, but panic buried for decades. When the name John was mentioned, the atmosphere shifted instantly. James remembered vague warnings and looks filled with hatred he had never understood. Hung was not surprised. He merely nodded as if he had long expected this piece of the puzzle. Mr. Huan admitted that their family had benefited from another family's collapse, that he had not destroyed them directly, but had chosen silence while the system did it for him. That silence over time became an unforgivable guilt. When John returned, not to seek immediate revenge but to uncover the past, Mr. Huan panicked. And that fear made him see Diep as a threat, a bridge that could drag buried secrets back into the light. James turned to Hung, finally understanding why his younger brother had always kept a distance from the truth. Hung stood there quietly, like a gatekeeper of a door that, once opened, would cause everything to collapse. When James asked whether Diep was connected to that past, Mr. Huan did not answer at once. That brief hesitation was enough for James to understand that his father's fear was not baseless, but never justified. Hung stepped forward and placed a hand on James's shoulder, a silent reminder that he did not have to carry everything alone. He said the truth would always find its way out, and the only way not to be crushed by it was to face it together. No more commands from above, no more control, only a choice. The light in the room fell across the faces of the three men, each carrying a different piece of the past. James understood that this conversation could not resolve everything, but it had shifted the balance of power within that house. For the first time, Mr. Huan was no longer the sole decision-maker, and for the first time, James realized that Hung was not just the one standing behind him, but the one who had quietly kept the truth from destroying him before he was strong enough to face it. When his father's final confessions fell into silence, the room sank into stillness once more. But this time, the silence no longer suffocated. It felt like the moment after a storm, when everything is still in disarray but the sky has begun to clear. James stood motionless, feeling his heartbeat slow. He no longer felt panic or rage. Instead, there was a cold clarity, the kind that comes only when someone has reached the very end and has nothing left to lose. James looked at his father for a long time, not with the eyes of a son seeking approval, but with the gaze of a man standing on his own feet. He spoke, his voice low and steady, saying that he would no longer run, not from his family's past, not from John, and not from whatever might come next. No matter how ugly the truth might be, he wanted to face it by his own choice, not continue living in fear designed by someone else. Mr. Huan froze. In that moment, he realized that the power he had held for so many years was slipping from his grasp, not because it was taken from him, but because James was no longer giving it to him. He asked whether James understood what he was doing, whether he knew that digging up the past could destroy everything that remained of the family. James nodded. He understood perfectly. But he also understood that living inside a gilded cage built of lies and control was far more destructive than any brutal truth. Hung spoke up, this time not to confront, but to stand beside James. He said that if John wanted to talk, they would meet him. If there were wrongs to face, they would face them. They would not place the blame entirely on the previous generation, nor would they allow the next generation to bear it in their stead. This was no longer a matter of one individual, but the ending of a cycle that had lasted for 20 years, a cycle fed by fear, silence, and decisions made on behalf of others. James turned to Hung, his eyes no longer hesitant for the first time. He said he did not want to continue living in the shadow of secrets he had never created. He would not allow Diep to be dragged into a war that did not belong to her. Nor would he let his love become a hostage to past mistakes. If John wanted the truth, James would be the one to listen, not to justify, but to understand and to take responsibility for his part in the present. As they stood to leave the room, James paused at the doorway and looked back at his father one last time. There was no reproach, no plea. He simply said that from this moment on, he would live his life by his own choices. Mr. Huan did not respond immediately. There was only a slow, heavy nod, a belated acknowledgement that he had lost control, but perhaps had also narrowly avoided losing his son altogether. Outside, night had fully fallen. The road ahead of James was unclear, full of twists and dangers, but for the first time in many years, he did not feel pushed forward. He was walking on his own. Hung walked beside him, saying nothing, yet his presence was enough for James to know he was not alone. Ahead of them lay the truth, John, and consequences they could not predict. And James understood that from this moment on, everything would change, not because he had won, but because he had chosen not to run anymore. Diep stood alone by the window, the yellow light casting a gentle yet weary glow across her face. The city below was as noisy as ever, but inside her, there was a frightening stillness. She knew that from the moment James decided to face the truth, nothing would be simple again. What had been buried for 20 years was slowly resurfacing, and she, despite having committed no wrong, stood at the very intersection of all those fractures. Diep had known part of the truth for a long time, far longer than James imagined. She knew about the land years ago, about the families swept into the vortex of power, and about the name John that always appeared like a scar that never healed. She knew because her family had once been witnesses, had chosen silence in order to survive, and that silence had followed her throughout her life, teaching her that some truths never truly sleep. They merely wait for the right moment to awaken. When James entered the room, Diep did not ask what had happened. She only looked at him for a long time. That gaze alone was enough for James to know that she had already guessed part of the outcome of his conversation with his father. James stepped closer and took her hand. His was colder than usual. He said he would no longer run, that he would face John, face his family's past, and that he needed her to know this before everything moved beyond control. Diep tightened her grip on James's hand. In that moment, she had to confront the choice she had always feared the most. If she told him everything she knew, James would be hurt, but he would no longer be in the dark. If she remained silent, she could keep the present stable a little longer, but that stability would be fragile and false. Diep understood clearly. Silence had once protected her family, but it was also the very thing that prolonged everyone's pain. She looked at James, the man who had lost everything and still chose to stand upright. Diep realized that love was not about shielding each other from the truth, but about walking through it together. Slowly, she told him everything she knew, without embellishment, without excuses. She spoke of her family, of their connection to Mr. Hohn's past, and of the fear that had followed her through the years of loving James in silence. Each word was like a cut, but also a release. James listened without interrupting. When Diep finished, the room fell quiet. He did not blame her, did not grow angry. He felt only a deep, lingering sadness. He understood that Diep, too, was a victim of a past she had not created. He embraced her, not to protect her this time, but to acknowledge that they were both standing amid the wreckage. Diep rested her head against James's shoulder, silent, tears falling. She said she was ready to face John if necessary, ready to answer the questions the past demanded. But she did not want their love to remain suspended between fear and control. If they were to move forward, they had to do so with the whole truth, no matter the cost. Outside, the night had grown deep. Diep and James stood side by side, looking toward a future that was uncertain but no longer invisible. She understood that from this moment on, she was not only James's lover, but an inseparable part of a larger story, one where past and present were forced to meet. And whether what lay ahead was pain or release, Diep knew she had chosen correctly. No longer standing aside, no longer remaining silent, but stepping into the center of the truth with the man she loved, to write their own ending together. James finally confronts his father, Hoan, as long-buried secrets surface inside the cold family house. Supported by Hung, James refuses to keep running and demands the truth behind years of control, exile, and fear. Hoan admits his rise to power was built on silence, moral compromise, and a dark connection to John, whose return threatens to expose everything. James chooses responsibility over escape, determined to face the past on his own terms. Meanwhile, Diep reveals she has known part of the truth for years, carrying her family's silence like a hidden wound. Instead of turning away, she chooses honesty and stands beside James. Together, they accept that love cannot survive on secrets. As night falls, the characters step into an uncertain future, no longer protected by lies, but strengthened by truth, choice, and the courage to confront consequences together.